So while we wait for all the participants to join the meeting, I guess Annie can go ahead and give some brief background about what SWE Next does and how it facilitates the transitioning students. Annie is the SWE Next Transitions Group head. So yeah. Oh, sorry. Yeah. So she will just give a very brief introduction. I just need to. Can you share now, Annie? Is it any?
Yep, I got the share screen now. Hold on.
Okay.
Let me get the right thing up. All right. Everybody, can you already see this? Hopefully.
Yeah.
All right. Oops. Not sure if this is working right, but oh well. All right. So for anybody who's not aware or isn't that familiar, I'll give a little bit of a brief introduction to what Suitenext is. So Suitenext is a program created by SWE that is supported by our student programs, or I believe we've renamed the committee now, but Suitenext committee. And it's basically a way for us to interact and help out potential engineering girls in engineering before they get into college and professional careers, which is when typically SWE is most active in their lives. But this is us basically doing a lot of grade school outreach, and we have lots of benefits and opportunities for girls to get more involved in college engineering and college prep type materials prior to their making decisions for their own careers. And it's a totally free program. And if anybody has any interest in learning more about it, you can contact me or Gayatri afterwards. But Suitenext, part of Suitenext is Suitenext clubs. So we are trying to expand this to be a more kind of like official club within a lot of schools, just like you would have typically like, debate or like, science bowl or whatever. So we've got, anybody can form a Suitenext club as long as you have an active SWE number to start it. So if you are not a part of the Suitenext club yet and want to either be a part of one or help found one, please contact this email, suitenextclubs@swe.org, and they will help you get that process started. It's a great way to get involved and make friends in SWE and engineering interests. So this is some of the things that you can do with as a Suitenext club. You can have projects that you can participate in to help the community, engineering competitions, invite SWE members to, basically talk about their careers, just like this presentation, but a little bit more on the local level, and give local tours, hopefully when COVID is over, and do more STEM outreach. So any questions before the official actual panel starts? All right. I think, Gayatri, with that, I believe you could probably just get started.
Yeah. Okay. So thank you everyone for joining us today over here. And today the agenda is to discuss about 4 uncommon or relatively new engineering majors or concentrations. And as it was mentioned before, it's nanotechnology, ceramic engineering, humanitarian engineering, and mechatronics, which all of you graduates can think of, high school graduates can think of pursuing. So we are joined today by 4 exceptional women here who have a very extensive knowledge about all these fields. So one by one, I will just quickly introduce them, and I will hand them over to introduce the engineering field and tell you a little bit about it and get excited about it. So first we have Professor Lisa Klein. She's from Rutgers University, and she's the chair of Material Science and Engineering, and she was the first woman to receive tenure at Rutgers. So all the girls in the house take inspiration from Professor Klein. And it's Professor Laura Anson from Johns Hopkins University, and she is the Vice Chair for Research and the Marcella E. Wolf Professor for Ophthalmology at Wilmer Institute, the Nanomedicine Division. She's also an Associate Professor in Ophthalmology, Chemical and Biomolecular Engineering, Biomedical Engineering, Pharmacology, Molecular Science, Pharmacology and Molecular Sciences, Gynecology and Obstetrics, sorry for my pronunciation there, infectious diseases and oncology. I'm sure over there will be more things added to this. Like from Professor Einstein, I think we can learn to be as diverse as possible. Then Ms. Julia Roos from Colorado School of Mines. She's the Associate Director of Humanitarian Engineering and supports the administration and strategic growth of Humanitarian Engineering program. Humanitarian engineering is something very new to me, and I'm really excited to know about it. And then finally, we have Ms. Jasmine Palmer from Stanford University, where she's a PhD student and works on wearable haptics. So that's something very interesting to know about again. Just a few notes before we actually go into the main event is, the event is divided into two parts. The first is where you will hear the introductions, and the second part is where we will do the Q&A. We want the event to be really interactive. So please don't hesitate to ask questions. You guys have given us a lot of questions. You have submitted a lot of questions, and I will ask them, but feel free to ask more questions. If you have questions in between while our panelists are speaking, please type them out in the chat and I will read them out, or you can raise your hand and you can then ask your questions. Feel free to keep your video on. In fact, I encourage to keep your video on, but please put your mic on mute. So that we don't have any background noise coming in. With that, I think we can start. I guess Professor Klein, you can go first and just tell us.
Okay, I'm going to share my screen, and here we go. Okay, I'm going to leave it in this format because I'm going to go through it very quickly. So thank you very much for inviting me, and it's always exciting to tell students about the opportunities you have in ceramic engineering. So I'm a ceramic engineer. I've been for some time now, and ceramic engineering is found in departments of material science and engineering. So we know the traditional materials, that's metal composites, but now what we really talk about is revolutionary materials, because we expect materials to do more than just one thing. For example, if you have a material and you want it to be strong, and there is a flaw that's developing that might contribute to its weakness, we want the material to tell you about it before anything goes wrong, and perhaps have the capability of self-healing. So it needs to be smart, tell you what's happening, and if it can fix itself, it could be self-healing. So we want revolutionary materials. Okay. So I just want to point out that materials enable everything, and that we can find ceramic materials in all of these cases. In infrastructure, it's concrete. In energy and windmills, it's the fiberglass reinforcement. In hypersonics, it's the materials that can withstand high temperatures. And of course, there's fiber optics. So what do ceramic engineers do? They characterize materials, they select them, they process them, they test them, they inspect them. They want to know that they're reliable, that they can identify any failures and prevent them in the future. And they develop new materials and perform research. And all of these fields in engineering, I think what students will find is we do them as teams. It's a very interdisciplinary field to begin with, all of engineering. So we're always working in teams, and a materials engineer or a ceramic engineer is just one member of a larger team. But what can you expect if you choose this as a major in college? It's one of the smaller departments. So one of the benefits that our students have is that they're in smaller classes, typically 30 to 50 students major in this at a big state university like Rutgers. And we do cover all different materials, including nanotechnology and biomaterials. And that's just a picture of some of my students who were testing their solar cells, one of the things we get to do in the lab. We also find that in material science and ceramics that there's a lot of hands-on learning. We spend a lot of time in our project labs and not so much time staring at simulations on screens. So why did I choose this? I have to think back to the very start. I'm what they call a Sputnik child. I was in first grade when Sputnik, the first satellite, was launched into space, and the Soviets launched their satellite before the US did. And there was a race, a space race, that pretty much continued from first grade through 12th grade. And in 12th grade, the astronauts landed on the moon. So that was the finale for my high school education. I don't know where the students who are tuning in today are from. I don't know if they're all from around Baltimore, but anyway, I'm from Wilmington, Delaware, and I went to Mount Pleasant Public High School. And I went to MIT for engineering, and I got my BS there, and I stayed for my PhD. And I think about all the problems that we have that we need to solve as engineers, and one of them is the fact that this place is much more crowded than it was when I was born. So what do I like to think about? I pose the question, how can we save energy? What are some alternatives to internal combustion engines? How can we build a better battery? And these are topics that all fall within a material science department. And in particular, my material of choice is glass. I'm a big fan of glass. So I have worked on aerogels, which is lightweight glass, and on coatings on glass, such as the ones that make glass darken by the flip of a switch. And of course, I love the glass that's on our smartphone. In fact, if it weren't for the piece of glass that was invented by a ceramic engineer from Rutgers, we wouldn't have a smartphone. And just think about how your life would be different if you didn't have that smartphone. Here are a few ways. You have to carry a camera. You'd have to carry change for the payphone. You might ask a human being for directions when you get lost, and you would have less entertainment. So Gorilla Glass is basically what enabled the smartphone. And you know that what you do to your smartphone is terrible. You shove it in your pocket, you throw it in your backpack. You wouldn't do that to a drinking glass. So, and since we know you can't get a signal if you have a metal case on a smartphone, it has to be glass and it has to be a plastic backing. So just to think about it, that's a really remarkable piece of glass. Now, one of the problems is that smartphones contain 70 elements. And remember, humans only have 28 elements. So that's a pretty good part of the periodic table. So here's one of the problems with our smartphones. It's hard to recycle them. Another good problem for engineers to solve. So who hires our engineers? If you have a degree in ceramic engineering, there are personal products companies. There are the manufacturing companies, all of the structural and car companies. They have to hire ceramic engineers. And so I'm done with that. And thank you, Gayatri, for organizing this webinar.
Thank you, Professor Klein. That was a really comprehensive overview of both ceramic engineering and the entire program. I guess Professor Einstein can go next.
Sure, so let me share my screen. So I'll be talking a bit about nanomedicine. So nanotechnology is, actually a really, really broad term. So there's, there's obviously, nanotechnology involved in materials. There's nanotechnology used in imaging, diagnostics, lots of different, other fields. But the nanotechnology that my lab primarily works on is more the medical application. So we call nanomedicine. And that's what I'll be talking to you about. So we also, kind of how we refer to it, the field that we work in is drug delivery. So we often say that, you know, drugs or medications suffer from a delivery problem. And so what I mean by that is, make sure these work. Okay, so this is a general diagram of the circulatory system. So our most favorite ways of taking medications are either oral pills or injections. You know, it could be a systemic injection or an intramuscular injection. So these are more, you know, these are what we would call like systemic, or, you know, kind of ways of dosing drugs that reach your whole body, affect your whole body. And so what this overlay is, if anyone's ever been to Body Worlds, which I've been a couple times, it's pretty cool. This is, you know, so this is actually, if you take a human cadaver and then inject a polymer and do a polymer cast of their actual circulatory system, it's far more complicated than that diagram, right? Like there's blood vessels everywhere. They're so dense that you can hardly see through this polymer casting. And so I illustrate this just to make the point that, you know, if you take a drug orally, or if you get an injection and it gets into your bloodstream, it's going to go everywhere in your body. Like there's not a single cell that it's not going to reach. And so why, you know, this is kind of an issue though. So, you know, our blood vessel system is actually about 60,000 miles long based on estimates. Some estimates are even up to like 100,000 miles long, depending on if you're an adult male or an adult female, you know, which is long enough to go around the world more than twice. And so then this is where the delivery problem aspect comes in. So like if you were to take a drug, you know, take a pill, and let's say I want that drug to get specifically to my eye or something like that. And I say that because I work in the Wilmer Eye Institute. Then really that's kind of like throwing, you know, it's like message in a bottle, throwing that drug in a bottle. And just if I went out to the Inner Harbor and threw it out into the ocean and hoped that it got to India, right? Like it's kind of the same size scale that we're talking about. And so then what that means is that, you know, when we take drugs in traditional ways, like very little of it actually gets to where we want it to go. And so what that means then is that everywhere else that it goes, it has side effects. And so the most common example that we give that is often the most relatable for people is chemotherapy. Most of us know someone that's, you know, had cancer and been through chemotherapy, and knows about the tremendous side effects that result from taking these drugs, because, you know, chemotherapy drugs are intended to stop rapidly dividing cells, which tumor cells are. But so are your skin cells, so are your epithelial cells, so are your hair follicles. And so that's why then when the drug is having its intended effect, but on an unintended spot, that's where all of your side effects come from. And so a lot of drugs actually have what we would consider, or what we call dose limiting side effects. So it's basically like it works really well the way that you want it to work, but we can't take it in a way that it actually is effective without having too many other problems and too many other side effects. And so then we work on nanomedicine then as a solution to this issue and kind of improving drug delivery. And so if we think about nanoparticles, so this is where, so I'm a chemical engineer by training, but we also like to think about size scales. So nanoparticles are much smaller than cells. So this is just kind of graphically showing that a cell is on the order of about 10 microns in size, whereas, you know, when we talk about nanoparticles, we're usually talking about, you know, 100 nanometers, maybe as large as 500 nanometers. But this is also in the size range of like a virus or a bacteria, right? So when a nanoparticle sees a cell, it's like it can interact with it very much like a virus would, and so you can have really unique properties then, and then also you can imagine that whatever is contained within that particle is, you know, kind of selectively going to that cell and being taken up. And so why that's interesting is because even though nanoparticles are very small compared to cells, they're much larger than small molecules like drugs. So a small molecule like ibuprofen, for example, something like that, might be about a nanometer in size. And so then what that means is that we can actually package potentially, you know, 100,000 drug molecules into a single nanoparticle. So if you engineer it such that it, you know, specifically interacts with cells in a way that is more targeted, then you have this very concentrated drug payload that you're delivering right to the cells that you want it to go to. And so this is a great time to be talking about nanomedicine and its applications because of COVID vaccines. And so the COVID vaccines, I mean, we all talk about how they're mRNA, right? So like that's usually the highlight of what we talk about, it's mRNA. messenger RNA. So it, messenger RNA is basically the, it is the message that tells the cell to create these spike proteins, which are then the antigen that gets presented to your immune cells. And then the end goal is that you get antibody production, right? So then if a virus comes in that has this spike protein, it'll get neutralized by the antibodies that have been produced, because of the vaccine. But mRNA is incredibly labile, like it gets degraded within minutes or not, if not seconds, inside the cell. And outside the cell, it's even worse. And so the way that the Moderna and the Pfizer vaccines are formulated is that they're lipid nanoparticles. So the mRNA is contained within this lipid nanoparticle where the lipid component, so this is basically a lipid bilayer. It's like a synthetic cell membrane that is protecting this mRNA. And so then this lipid bilayer then can fuse with the cell membrane, and then deliver the mRNA payload into the cytosol, into the cytoplasm, and then you have everything else that you need to have happen after that. But if we were just injecting mRNA into your muscle, you would not get an antibody response that would be protective, right? All that mRNA would just be degraded. So nanomedicine, we like to joke, it's saving the world right now. Well, for people that are getting vaccinated, that's a whole other lecture. But yeah, and so then even kind of the area that we work in though too, our lab, we kind of work in the translational space where we also do intellectual property, like patenting and things like that, and do startup companies. And so this is just an example. So one of the startup companies that's come out of our center, Kala Pharmaceuticals, they have 2 approved eye drop products on the market now that are nanoparticle based. So they're little nanocrystals of drug with a stabilizer coating, and essentially all it does is it results in much greater uptake. So even if it's at the same drug concentration, you're getting a lot more into your eye than if you were just using a conventional dosage form. And so what that means then is that the patients can use the eye drops much less frequently, but still have the same therapeutic benefit. And especially for things like eye drops, I don't know if anyone's used a lot of eye drops, but it's kind of, using eye drops is not very enjoyable actually. And so if you could do something once a day instead of, some types of eye drops you have to do 4 times a day, then that can be really impactful on patient quality of life and things like that. And so, yeah, that's basically all that I had. So nanomedicine, of course, so differently, it's not, people that work in nanomedicine, there's chemical engineers, there's biomedical engineers, there's pharmaceutical scientists. It tends not to just be engineering specific, but there are a lot of, in bioengineering too, a lot of engineers that work kind of in this area. It's great that, so many programs are all incorporating, or have been for years, incorporating kind of nanotechnology and things like that into the curriculum. Which is awesome. And, the medically applied aspects also, gotten, even since I was in undergrad, have gotten a lot of attention and things too. So yeah, that's basically all I had. But any questions or anything like that, there's my email, feel free. Yeah, thanks for inviting me.
Thank you, Professor Ensign. There was a really good introduction, and I guess I hope everyone got excited about nanotechnology and nanomedicine, because it's so relevant at this time in this century. Yeah, maybe Julian, you can go next, and then Jasmine can follow.
All right, give me 1 second to get this up. All right. Okay. As Gayatri mentioned, my name is Julia Ross. I'm going to speak to you a little bit about humanitarian engineering today, and I will admit it comes from specifically the perspective of my team here at Colorado School of Mines, but I tried to be as general as I could. A little bit about me. I am the Associate Director of the Humanitarian Engineering Program. I grew up in Montana. I studied systems engineering as an undergrad and then studied public health in graduate school. I worked for several years in consulting before I found my way to the humanitarian engineering program here, and really found a place where I felt like I could combine my engineering and my public health in an impactful way and connect with students who had similar interests. So I'm going to let a student share a little bit about how she defines humanitarian engineering. This is a former student from mine. So this is just a quick clip.
Humanitarian engineering, I would say, is trying to blend that technical education that you get with social sciences, and basically helping you connect how your technical work impacts people. A lot of the classes focus on taking a project that's very narrow and then expanding that and saying, okay, well, who is that actually impacting? Who's your stakeholders? And how could you include their needs better to actually be a better engineer? So that can cover a lot of things like international development, or more conventionally, like in the oil and gas industry, corporate social responsibility and community engagement is a very hot topic.
All right. So as you might have heard from Evelyn, a really important focus of humanitarian engineering is helping engineers learn to work with communities. So really focusing on that co-creation and co-design of just solutions to problems. So one component of humanitarian engineering is bringing together engineering and social sciences to really transform engineering. It's cross-disciplinary, and it really is intending to help change the way engineers think, define, and solve problems. And again, the focus is really on both the problem and the people. So who are the people? Where are they coming from? What do they see as the problem? Why is that important to them? Humanitarian engineering is very much about that relationship between social and technical, the people and the technology, or the engineering and science. So there's lots of reasons to pursue humanitarian engineering. It's really exciting because humanitarian engineering crosses disciplines. So regardless of your interest, your major, your background, where you want to go, you can learn about humanitarian engineering and then apply the principles and practices in your work. I've listed several opportunities that come from learning about, participating in, becoming a humanitarian engineer. There's a lot to do with thinking about the role of cultural, social, environmental, economic aspects of culture in shaping the way people respond to engineering. Humanitarian engineering helps you learn to think critically and ask about engineering design and why designs are being planned the way they are being planned, how design decisions are being made. It also allows you to learn how to work effectively with communities, how to partner with communities, conduct stakeholder engagement in a way that allows communities to really be involved and solve the problems together, because communities bring a lot of really important assets to the table, and they don't always get to participate in the design and resolution process. And there's also some really exciting research that crosses disciplines. So as a humanitarian engineer, you get to work with engineers across disciplines to solve some of the biggest and most complex challenges that are being faced today. Whoops. So you might be wondering, okay, how does humanitarian engineering help me in a job? We've heard from employers that humanitarian engineering students are really great at designing under restricted budgets, thinking about stakeholders across multiple realms within a project sort of system, working under conditions of ambiguity. So often in engineering school, your problem is pretty clearly designed, but once you get out into the world, there's a lot more ambiguity in the work that you do. Humanitarian engineering also really helps students gain professional skills like leadership, communication, as I mentioned, stakeholder engagement, project management. So there's a lot of professional skills you can get as you participate in a humanitarian engineering program. I included several more distant grads from the program here at Mine. So you can see a really wide variety of backgrounds. We have environmental engineers, civil engineers, biochemical engineers, mechanical engineers, doing really different jobs, but bringing their humanitarian engineering training and principles into those jobs. So at Mines, we have two pathways that you might see sort of split out between these students or former students. There are community development work for students who are interested in working at an NGO, going into the Peace Corps, working in the government, and then social responsibility for applying humanitarian engineering skills and practices inside of corporations. This is another student who just graduated a few years ago. She studied civil engineering. She got her minor in humanitarian engineering here at Mines, went into the Peace Corps, and now works at the Economic Development Administration, where she works as an engineer to make sure that millions of dollars in federal grants support community development in positive ways. Cassidy, this is another student who just graduated from Mines. She got her minor in engineering for community development and participated in some humanitarian engineering research in Latin America. She is now focused on pursuing a geological engineering degree that is addressing environmental risks in vulnerable communities. There are lots of ways you can encounter humanitarian engineering in your education. So there are undergraduate, graduate, and other options that you can find really across the entire world. I put a map here of some schools in the United States who are offering humanitarian engineering related educational opportunities, and you'll see those links at the bottom, and I'm happy to share those. This organization put together a report of humanitarian engineering really across the world. And more broadly, it's used, there are several different titles or ways that people refer to humanitarian engineering. And as I mentioned at Minds, I bring my Minds lens to the conversation. Just for an example, here at Minds, we have two undergraduate minors, engineering for community development and leadership and social responsibility. You can also do a humanitarian engineering focus area in our Minds design degree. And then at the graduate level, we have both a graduate certificate in humanitarian engineering that folks can do while they're working. It's available online. There's also a residential master's degree, which is available with either a research-based thesis project and takes about 2 years, and a professional practicum project, which usually takes about a year. So as I mentioned, schools also offer the other options presented here. And in many cases, you can even get a disciplinary degree and focus your research and course projects on humanitarian engineering topics. So that's all I have as an intro. I think we will do best if you bring questions and we can chat more in detail once we get to that point. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Julia. Jasmine, you want to go next?
Hi. My name is Jasmine. I am currently a rising third year PhD student at Stanford University. I have some slides to share for you. Can you, oops, that's, sorry about that.
We can see it.
Can you all see that properly?
Yeah.
Okay, so to introduce myself, as I said before, I'm a third year PhD student at MIT at Stanford. I did my bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering at MIT, and I did my master's at Stanford on the way to the PhD, also in mechanical engineering. And I'm here to talk to you about robotics and mechatronics, and I'll be a little more specific about what I do as someone working in the CHARM lab, the Collaborative Haptics and Robotics and Medicine lab, advised by Alison Okamura. So in general, mechatronics and robotics are extremely broad fields. I'd say mechatronics is the broadest. It includes robotics, and both fields include mechanical engineering, electrical engineering, computer engineering, even bioengineering, and the list can go on for quite a while. And what got me really interested in coming to this field is that honestly, I just think robots are really cool. As a kid, I was really inspired by like science fiction and comic books and just these really amazing inventions that I wished would be real. So I wanted to learn how to make that so. And more specifically, what I'm studying right now is along the intersection of what my lab focuses on of medical robotics, soft robotics, and haptics, where medical robotics is about applying robotics to assist medical professionals and like doctors and nurses and yeah, pretty much doctors and nurses and the surgeons, and soft robotics being about trying to get a little bit away from the conventional like hard, rigid robots and robots that are safer to be around humans, that are compliant in their structure so that they are safer to be around and to use alongside of us instead of replacing people. And then haptics, what I'm focusing on is about the sense of touch. So our lab focuses on these three disciplines. So as I mentioned, haptics is about relating to the sense of touch, and it's broken up into two types of feedback, tactile and proprioception. And so with tactile feedback, that's essentially the feedback we get from the skin, and proprioception being the feedback we get from the feeling of our joints and our limbs in space. So the fact that if you close your hands, you have a vague idea of where your fingers are located. That's what proprioception is. But you also have some tactile feedback where you feel like a bit of the wind on your fingers, and that gives you a wider sense of what's going on in your environment. And so of the 5 senses that we do have, we tend to take touch a little bit for granted. In Charm Lab, it's kind of our favorite sense. And typically we ask the students that we have outreach with, like, what's your most valuable sense and which one you would get rid of last? And usually people tend to get rid of touch last. But if you think about what the sense of touch encompasses, like skin, muscles, and joints, and where skin is the largest organ on your body, it kind of gives you an idea of how important haptics and the study of the sense of touch truly is. So just an example of what would happen if you didn't have that sense. We have the case of Ian Waterman, where he suffers from sensory neuropathy, which means that he essentially has no haptic feedback throughout his body. So he has no proprioception and has no idea like where his limbs are in space. So when he has to walk, he has to always see where he's going, because he can't really like have the sense of where his foot is with relation to the ground like we do. So just an example of why it's an important sense. And so it also differs from sight that we discussed in the Ian Waterman case, because sight is a centralized sense. It's broad, it's passive, meaning that you only can observe with them, that you can't interact with objects just by looking at them. And that it's cognitive, meaning that all of its processing takes place in the brain. Whereas touch is distributed, since you have skin all over your body. It's narrow, meaning that you only have local areas of sensation. So for example, if you poke something with your finger, you don't feel it on your knee, right? And then also it's active and physical, meaning that like you can use this sense to manipulate things with your hands. Our lab also focuses on something called design thinking, where we use this process to design new and novel haptic technologies for medical purposes, commercial purposes, entertainment, scientific purposes as well. And so our first step in that process is empathizing, where we interview our potential users and to find out what would provide them the most value. And it lets us define the problems that we're looking to solve, where we next look to define our next step, which is essentially just pretty much systematically laying out what exactly your problems are, and then moving on to ideation, where you essentially just think about like any idea, like no idea is a bad idea, like just throw any concept out there, and then you can move on to the prototyping stage, where you cut them down to your top 3 or top 5, and then make even physical representations of those ideas, and then you refine them further by the last step, which is testing. Yep, I was slow on the animations here. So for haptics, some of the things that we ask in the haptics field is like, what would be some interesting things we could do with this sense of touch? What if we could simulate the idea of making something feel fuzzy, sticky, or soft? Like if you touched your iPad screen, instead of just feeling glass, it felt fuzzy, or if it felt sticky, or if it felt squishy. Or like if you're watching a movie or playing a virtual reality game, if you could actually touch the objects in there, in the scene, or you could touch priceless works of art without actually having to touch them. And also importantly, what could you possibly learn from haptics, from kinesthetic learning? So speaking of teaching, these are the retention percentages of various teaching methods and metrics for all the different senses. And we're also interested in learning about like how much you can learn just from like how you feel. And so we program devices like to feel like springs, to feel viscous materials, and to train surgeons. So like like some fields that we focus on are like in entertainment and education and human computer interfaces, like your cars, your smartphones, airplane design. So robotics and haptics as a whole, they essentially can apply everywhere. And you can make pretty amazing things just from the foundations that are required to learn for this field. Sort of like the hands that we see here as a collaboration with Johns Hopkins and APL. This here is one of our soft robots that like can crawl into really small spaces for excavation purposes. We also study like social touch and see like if we can simulate like hugging people virtually. And this picture over here is also an example of like a surgical training example. So just to wrap up, I'd like to say like with robotics and mechatronics, like you can study like most things in the STEM fields and still end up in this field because it's so broad and it's so in demand now. Pretty much everything requires some amount of robotics knowledge at this point, since technology is so ingrained in our lifestyles. And I hope you would be interested in pursuing this in the future.
Thank you so much, Jasmine. And that last point was very true, that nowadays everything has been automated. So you want everything involves robotics, but you also want things that are more, that feel more like what humans feel to touch. So it's like more on soft robotics sides. So as you said, like all disciplines can be integrated into mechatronics/robotics to work into. If anyone in the audience has any question, please raise your hand. But I will start with some questions that our participants have already submitted during the registration. I've broken them down into like broad and specific. So I'll just go ahead and start with the more broader questions because they pertain to just like what engineering and which engineering. So I'll just first go and ask that. So the very first and the most common question that was asked was, how do you know which field is correct for you? And the second part of the broad question was that would, like in the beginning, in an undergraduate phase, should you just choose a more broader discipline, even though you know that you want to do some like a more focused subject later on? So those were the two most common questions. Any one of you can just go first.
Yeah, if I could, because one thing that I was struck with as I was listening to everyone else is that, no matter how far I get into my career, I never lose that feeling of like when I hear other people talk about what they do, I'm like, wow, that's cool. Like, and so, and then and it's almost like I feel like the more, at least for me, the more I work on the thing that I work on, the more I find what other people do cool. And so I would say, so I guess I say to students all the time that, I think like there's so many things and so many things that you don't even know exist yet, which is why events like this are really useful, that you could and will be excited about. And so, I feel like one thing I always advise students is to not put too much weight on, that type of decision, like whether you go into materials engineering or chemical engineering or biomedical engineering and mechanical. But I think also what was noticeable about some of the presentations and then like the backgrounds of the speakers is that a lot of fields, like actually lots of different types of engineers all work in that same field. So like you can end up in the same area, but from various different engineering majors anyway. So that kind of takes the pressure off too of, which one it is that you pick to start with.
Yes. Professor Klein.
I would echo that. I think one thing that I've heard from students, especially if you're interested in engineering and don't know what kind of engineering you want to do, so you want to do engineering, but you don't know what, it's really helpful to take classes across disciplines in your first year or two of college, and that helps you find the one that really makes you passionate, right? Like piques your interest, gets you into it. I had a student I work closely with, she started in mechanical, because when you come to mines, you're not allowed to declare your major, but you get to indicate what you're interested in. So she picked mechanical, it's very broad. And she took a geological engineering class and she fell in love. And now she's in geological engineering. So there are a lot of, I think exploring, especially early, is really important. Don't close your mind off to something because you think it's not right. It's always easier to say what you don't like than what you do like. There's so much out there, as Professor Ensign was saying. So I think keep your eyes open, pay attention to things that seem interesting to you, and learn how people get into those. And then you can see maybe these are some options for me to consider.
Yes, definitely. That's very true. Professor Klein, do you have anything to add?
I agree with what's been said, and I think at most schools, freshman year, you haven't selected your major, and you have an introduction course that does give you a survey, an open house, and a chance to tour the labs, and take advantage of it. We offer pizza, so we get lots of students that come by our open house and get free pizza.
Jasmine, do you have something to add? You're the youngest.
Sure. For me, I didn't have too difficult of a time choosing because I always knew I wanted to go into robotics. I know that's not the common case. I did have a lot of exposure to different STEM fields in middle school and high school. So I'd say exposure is truly the key. I got to decide so early because I knew from taking AP chemistry that I hated it and just didn't want to go to chemical engineering, and that I don't like squishy things. So no biological anything for me either. And that I've just always liked building things that were just like steel and wood and nuts and bolts, and that's really it. So yeah, I would just say exposure is truly the key. And with undergrad, MIT has you allows you to declare at the end of your first year, which I know is a little early for some schools. But you can always change your major later. That's always an option. It's not 100% permanent until you get the diploma. And then also, your first year, it doesn't really matter exactly what your major is unless you go to a school that doesn't have the kind of major you're interested in. So if you want to go to technical school and you're considering maybe pre-law, you might want to consider maybe going to a more broad university that has that kind of program. But just take all the classes that you possibly can and figure out what interests you or doesn't.
Yeah, that is true. So I guess we can summarize all the viewpoints into that, gain as much exposure as possible, try to explore all the different departments in your university during your first year, since you have a lot of time to declare your major. And remember that world right now is very interdisciplinary, as you might have seen from all the 4 talks, all the 4 introductions that you heard. So no matter where you start, you can always end up in a place which you will love at the end. So just keep on exploring and increase your exposure. That's all. Okay. The next question is, I guess it will be different in all cases, but what excited you when you started working in your particular field, or that aha moment when you selected, okay, this is what I want to work on. What excited you at that moment, and what keeps you excited as you keep on continuing in your own particular fields? Anyone?
Well, I can answer that one. Hopefully others will chime in. So in my case, as I said, I was a Sputnik kid, and I was taking a class on glass, and it was when moon rocks had just been returned from the moon surface, and they contained glass, something that wasn't expected. And I talked to the lecturer for the class, and I said, do you have any summer jobs? He said, how would you like to work on moon glass? So that was it. I knew exactly what I needed to do. And That was my aha moment. It also let me know that I really did like being in the lab and doing independent research and original research.
Yeah, so for me, you know, I actually, for a long time, I thought I wanted to be a doctor, and specifically a surgeon, a brain surgeon. And so I think my mom said I decided that when I was like 10 or something. But then I later on, you know, doing like a hospital internship type experience as a teenager, I realized that, you know, the concept of having a patient, you know, die on the table during a surgery was just something that emotionally I was just like, you know, I was not prepared or interested in having that kind of experience. So then, you know, I almost kind of had a crisis moment, probably I think the year before I was applying to college, like, okay, what am I going to do now? And so I looked to engineering, and then I ended up in the chemical and biomolecular engineering, because, you know, the bio part. And so I looked at engineering as a way that, you know, you can still have, you know, positive impact on human health and improve, you know, quality of life, but from a distance. And that's still, you know, with all the translational stuff and the entrepreneurial activity and things, like it really is all still motivated very much just by that, like improving quality of life.
So for me, I actually always knew I wanted to do engineering. I was really into math and science as a kid, but math especially, and I knew I didn't want to do math because I wasn't into theory. I wanted to use math. So engineering seemed like a great fit, but my engineering education wasn't as people focused as I was seeking, and I didn't realize that until after I finished, that I really wanted more people time, which was how I found my way to public health. And I really didn't know how to put the two together. So my aha moment was discovering humanitarian engineering, which really helped me identify, oh, this is who I am. It's engineering and it's people, and it's bridging the two. And so it took some exploring. I mentioned I consulted in multiple fields. I've changed careers several times in my life already, and don't think I will stop, although I'm pretty happy where I am. So maybe I'm stopped for a while, but I think it was really helpful for me to just stumble upon this amazing field that really connected my interests in a way that I didn't know was available to me.
Jasmine, I think in your case, we know the aha moment. It was right from the very beginning.
I'd say it was a mixture of that, but also it's like you can like have a bunch of aha moments, and then when you get to doing it, you realize it's not great. Sort of like what Professor Ensign was saying about wanting to be a doctor and then doing the internship and realizing it's not really for you. I feel like I did first robotics a lot in middle school and high school. So the fact that I was still like really into the field after, you know, spending really late nights working on robots and things like that, like really cemented for me that this was really the field for me.
Okay, so now we can move to more specific questions. So I'm going to first ask some questions on to Professor Einstein. There are two. So the first one is, how do you decide between biochemistry and biomolecular engineering in order to apply to college?
Okay, so my answer to that is going to be very biased by the fact that I'm an engineer. So, and even kind of in my, you know, my undergraduate experience, you know, I had a part-time job touring for the College of Engineering at Ohio State, where I did my undergraduate training, and, you know, talking about that, and, you know, with recruiting events and things like that, that in general, you know, engineering is a much more broad training, like even if you within a specific type of engineering. So you know, even so in chemical and biomolecular engineering, like we took chemistry, we took physics, we took quantum mechanics, we took mechanical engineering courses, electrical engineering courses. Like you get a really broad kind of training, and that's similar for other engineering majors as well, where like in the curriculum, right, there's a lot of crossover. Like you learn basics of, you know, lots of things in all the different areas. And so, you know, what you kind of hear from like a recruiting aspects, you know, both if you're talking about industry or if you're talking about medical school or, you know, all kinds of different areas, you know, people with engineering training are generally considered, you know, very trainable, I guess you could say, or very broadly capable of doing lots of different types of jobs. And so, so that's also one of the reasons why, engineers also tend to have, some of the highest salary levels coming out of, undergraduate degrees and things like that as well. It's just connected, right? And so at least for me, and actually my own son is we're dropping him off to start college tomorrow, and he's going to be majoring in bioengineering. And in having this conversation with him, it was the same thing. Like we were talking about, like just the breadth of the education and how that really then actually positions you to make a decision, lots of different choices once you actually finish your degree. And again, I'm not saying anything against biochemistry, because I even have some graduate students in my lab that have degrees in biochemistry and then went into engineering for graduate school. But that's just that's my opinion on it.
And the next question is, in nanomedicine, you deal with things at an atomic, molecular, or a small scale. Do you also deal with going back and making drugs better, or is it just looking at the disease and trying to create medicines that will help human body or deliver them in a better fashion?
Yeah, that's a good question. We do a bit of both. So we do a lot of work where we start with drugs that are known drugs, they're approved drugs, but we're just packaging them in a way that they become more effective when they're dosed that way as a nano formulation. But we also do a lot of work with labs and like drug discovery groups where they're discovering new molecules and even doing like new pathways, new therapeutics, and then we're also packaging those and delivering those. And so in the preclinical sense, kind of doing validation of new drugs and new targets, but also with the drug delivery component. So yes, we do both. From a translational perspective, like when you're thinking about companies and INDs like FDA, all that kind of like getting into clinical trials. When you're starting with a known drug, then the hurdles to getting into clinical studies are a little lower. But at the same time, some of the really big game-changing kinds of discoveries within medicine, treating disease, or with new drugs. And so then you're dealing with what we call a new chemical entity, which has a lot more regulatory components to it. But anyway, to circle back around to answering that question, it's both.
Thank you. My next question is for Professor Klein, and I guess you pretty much answered it in your introduction. So the question was, is ceramic engineering similar to materials engineering, which you already answered, but I want to extend that and ask if someone takes ceramic engineering as his or her concentration, would they be in any way limited as to in terms of understanding other materials and their applications and properties?
Well, historically, they were in two different departments. There were ceramic engineering departments and there were material science departments. Most of those material science departments came from metallurgy. There's an awful lot of overlap. And I think nowadays, there isn't a disadvantage. You of course, choose the material within all the possible materials that excites you, but you know the basics, so people can move around within the industries.
See, that's good to know. Right? You're not restricted even though you choose a certain thing, right. So a specific material. For Jasmine, you touched upon the applications that mechatronics or robotics has, but in terms of haptics or variables, can you tell us about some other fields where robotics is being applied or mechatronics is being applied and where it will be in the future? So I guess the student was trying to gauge how the future will look if he or she takes this major, decides to pursue this major.
Yeah, so some really interesting applications are definitely in the entertainment space. Like I'm actually doing research in virtual reality right now and haptics in virtual reality, like being able to feel objects that don't exist in real space, but they exist on a computer, and trying to feel like what those would feel like. Those have really interesting applications for surgical training, which is what I'm focusing on. how to get surgeons to practice on a virtual object instead of on a person, so that there's less chance of complications and less discomfort for the patient. There's also entertainment. Anyone who has a Nintendo Switch probably knows the vibrotactile feedback it gives you when you enter a room and it just vibrates, there's something coming after you, or if you've hit something. There's also manufacturing is a really interesting one. As you all know, we have increasingly more complex smartphones and integrated devices, and those are built with components that are so small and so delicate that human hands can't touch them. It would ruin the process. It would ruin the device. And so a lot of robotics are applied in those kinds of applications as well. And self-driving cars is also a very interesting one. There's a lot of safety applications and an interest in that kind of field. And yeah, I mean, I could kind of go on for days about all the cool applications of robotics. It's truly an interesting field. You could probably name something, and I could think of how robotics could be applied at in some capacity. I'm not sure if that really answered your question.
So in short, everything that is in your site and more. So
Yeah,
that has
essentially.
robotics involved in it. That is great. Julia, I had a few questions for you as well, but you kind of answered it all in your introduction. People wanted to know about some projects that are involved in it and how humanitarian engineering can be used in an actual setting, and you already answered it really well. So if anyone among the participants has any question, last 2 minutes or 1 minute. I don't want to, we are already past 6 and I don't want to keep anyone from their engagements. Okay, I guess we don't have any more questions at this point. If anyone does have at a later point, feel free to reach out to me and I will try my best to answer them. I would really like to thank all our panelists. Thank you so much for taking the time from your schedules, dedicating 1 hour to this event. It really means a lot, and I came to know about a lot of new things. And I wish I had something like this when I was transitioning from high school to undergrad. It would have given me a lot more options and a lot more things to think about even as I move ahead. But it's really, really great to know about all of these things, and thank you so much. Yeah, I guess that's it. Everyone is thanking you. And yeah.
Well, we look forward to seeing more young women coming into engineering, right?
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes,
Yes.
indeed.
Great.
Yes.
Awesome.
That is
Thanks
the
everyone
goal.
for coming.
Thank you.
And have a good evening and a good weekend.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.